Welcome back to the deep dive. It is great to have you with us. I was scrolling through the news this morning, doing the usual thing, and it just feels like Groundhog Day.
Oh, I know that feeling.
Let me guess.
Geneva.
Geneva. You see the headlines about the U.S.-Iran nuclear talks, and it's always the same language. Progress, technical hurdles, closing the gap.
It's a loop, isn't it? Always
Oh.
about centrifuge counts, enrichment percentages, how many kilos of uranium they can have. It's all very mathematical.
Exactly. We're always on the edge of some breakthrough on the mechanics of it all. But today, we're going to pivot a bit. We're taking a step back from that negotiation table to look at some research you've brought in that, well, it suggests we might be missing the forest for the trees.
That's a good way to put it.
And the core question for our deep dive today is pretty provocative. Are we negotiating the wrong problem with Iran?
It is, but I think it's a necessary question. The whole premise of the analysis we're diving into, which pulls a lot from Albert Hadi's book, Shadow Soldiers, is that while we're all focused on the hardware of the threat,
The nukes.
right, the nukes, the missiles, we're completely ignoring the software, the operating system, if you will.
And by software, you mean the ideology.
The ideology, the Constitution, the structural DNA of the state. The argument is that this whole nuclear crisis is just a symptom. The actual disease is a fundamental constitutional mandate that makes normal relations, almost impossible.
Regardless of what gets signed in Switzerland.
Exactly.
Okay, that is a big claim because, we usually assume countries operate on realpolitik. I want this, you want that, let's make a deal. You're saying Iran doesn't quite work that way.
Well, they do negotiate, of course.
Right.
But the sources argue that Iran's behavior isn't just about policy choices that change with, say, a new president.
Right.
It's about a mandate. And it's not some secret backroom mandate. It's written in black and white in their 1979 Constitution. Specifically, we have to look at Article 154.
Article 154. I have to admit, I haven't brushed up on the Iranian constitution recently. What's it say?
So Article 154 explicitly commits the Islamic Republic to support, and I'm basically quoting here, the just struggles of the oppressed against the arrogant in every corner of the globe.
Wait, the arrogant, is that the actual legal term?
It is.
That sounds more like something from a sermon, not a constitution.
It does, doesn't it? But that's the point. In their worldview, the world is binary. You have the Mustazafun, the oppressed, and the Mustakbarun, the arrogant. And guess who they see as the head of the arrogant camp?
The United States. So this article isn't just poetic language. It's not just some revolutionary cheerleading from back in '79.
No, and this is where the analysis really gets sharp. The source material argues this article frames external activism, which is a nice way of saying interfering in other countries, not as a foreign policy option, but as a state duty.
A duty, so it legally obligates them to intervene.
Yes, it's a wild concept for a constitution. Most are about, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense.
Yeah.
They're inward-looking.
This sounds like a mandate for export, for exporting the revolution itself.
That is precisely how Albert Hadi describes it in Shadow Soldiers. He says the Iranian state was built with that mission. So you, the diplomat in Geneva, are thinking about enrichment purity. But the person across the table from you is operating under a constitution that legally requires them to challenge you globally.
Which brings up the question of how, a constitution is just paper. I can write, I own the moon on a napkin, but unless I have a rocket, it means nothing. How do they actually enforce this?
That's Article 150. If Article 154 is the mission statement.
Article 150 is the machinery.
You got it. That's the article that established the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC.
Okay, we hear about the IRGC all the time. Sanctions, skirmishes in the Strait of Hormuz. But I think for a lot of people, it's just the Iranian army.
And that's a really common misconception. Iran has a regular army, the Artesh. Their job is normal army stuff. Defend the borders, protect the territorial integrity of Iran.
Right.
The IRGC is different. The Constitution itself defines their job as being the guardian of the revolution and its achievements.
Okay, I see the split. One guards the soil, the other guards the idea.
Precisely. And because the idea of the revolution is global, thanks to Article 154, the IRGC's operations are global. They aren't limited by borders because, to them, the ideology isn't limited by borders.
And this must be what Hadi's book, Shadow Soldiers, gets into, this fusion of the state and the militia.
Yes, he calls it a fusion of ideology and institutional sovereignty. In this kind of system, security isn't just about stopping an invasion. Security is defined as revolutionary continuity.
Meaning if the revolution stops expanding outward, The fear is it dies inward.
It stagnates and dies. So the IRGC, and specifically its external arm, the Quds Force, that's the tool they use to keep the movement alive.
The Quds Force, that was Qasem Soleimani's unit for decades.
Correct. And Hadi's analysis really shows how they operationalize that constitutional mandate. They find oppressed groups, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shia militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and they build them up. It's not just money and guns.
It's a whole model.
It is. They transfer technology, they provide training. They essentially clone the revolutionary state within a state model in other countries.
And the sources pointed to a moment where the U.S. really started to officially recognize this structure, right?
Yes. The timeline is important here. In 2007, the U.S. designated the Quds Force for supporting terror groups. That was specific, targeted. But 2019 was the watershed moment.
That's when the entire IRGC was labeled a foreign terrorist organization, an FTO.
Yes, and we should pause on that because the significance, I think, got lost in the headlines. It was the very first time the United States had ever applied that designation, a terrorist label, to an official state military.
Which is a huge break in diplomatic protocol. FTOs are usually non-state actors. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, groups hiding out in the mountains, not the uniformed military of a UN member.
Completely unprecedented.
Yeah.
And the analytical takeaway, according to the source, is that it signaled a shift. U.S. institutions were no longer seeing these external operations as rogue elements or just bad behavior.
They were seeing it as inseparable from the state itself.
An acknowledgement that, in a structural sense, the state is the network.
Okay, but I have to push back a little here. I mean, I have to play devil's advocate because this all sounds very deterministic. Like they're just robots programmed for this.
Please do.
Isn't Iran also a rational actor? We hear that from analysts all the time. They calculate costs and benefits. Look at the 2015 nuclear deal. The JCPOA, they came to the table.
They did.
They poured concrete into a reactor core. They did that because sanctions were crushing their economy. Doesn't that prove they're transactional? That if you squeeze them hard enough, the ideology takes a backseat to survival.
It's a very, very valid challenge. It's really the central debate. Rational actor versus ideological state. And the sources we're looking at today meet this head on. Their answer is, yes, Iran is rational.
Okay, so they're not suicidal.
No, not at all. They're highly pragmatic. They know exactly how to calibrate an attack, how far to push a proxy before the U.S. might respond. They know when to pull back to save the regime. But, and this is the absolute crucial distinction the analysis makes, rationality does not negate ideology.
Okay, unpack that. How can you be a fanatic and a pragmatist at the same time?
Think of it like this. You can be very rational in how you pursue your goals, but the goals themselves are set by your ideology. The source argues that for Iran, the great Satan rhetoric, the proxy networks, they aren't just episodic tools they pick up and put down for leverage.
They're structural features.
Exactly. They're always on.
So they might be clever about how or when they fight the great Satan, but the fact that they must fight is, well, it's not up for debate.
Precisely. The question isn't whether Iran makes calculations, it's whether that ideological machinery, the IRGC, the Quds Force, keeps running regardless of a deal. And the analysis suggests that even with sanctions relief, the machinery keeps running because its fuel isn't economic.
Its fuel is the mandate.
Yes. The pragmatism is tactical, but the hostility is strategic. And that takes us to the theological dimension. Because if we really want to understand why, we have to look at the religious part. The source calls our failure to do this conceptual constriction.
Conceptual constriction? Sounds like something you'd get a prescription for.
It's basically a fancy term for tunnel vision. We focus on what we can measure. Enrichment levels, breakout times. You can put those on a spreadsheet.
But you can't put revolutionary zeal on a spreadsheet.
You can't. And by focusing only on the atoms, we ignore the great Satan doctrine.
Okay, the great Satan. We've heard that phrase since 1979. It almost feels like a cliche now. You know, death to America, the great Satan. It's just noise to fire up a crowd, isn't it?
And that's exactly the mistake the analysis warns against. It's not just name-calling. This term shows up systemically. In official speeches, state media, school textbooks, it frames the U.S. not as a competitor you disagree with on trade,
but as a systemic adversary, an entity whose very existence is a threat to yours.
Yes, and this comes from the absolute top, from Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And it's not just a political stance. We have to talk about that 2010 fatwa the source mentioned. This really shifted my perspective.
I saw that in the notes, 2010. This was just after the Green Movement protests, when the regime was looking a bit shaky.
The context is everything. In 2010, in the middle of that turmoil, Khamenei issues a fatwa. And in it, he proclaims himself the representative of the Prophet Muhammad and the 12th Imam on earth.
Whoa, hold on. I knew he was the supreme leader, that the title had religious weight, but claiming to be the representative of the Prophet himself, that's definitive.
It's absolute.
Yeah.
In Shia belief, the 12th Imam is the Mahdi, the messianic figure who is in hiding. So by claiming to be his representative, Khamenei isn't just saying I'm the president, he's claiming divine authority.
So for a follower, for a Quds Force operative or a Basij militiaman, what does that mean on a practical level?
It changes everything. I mean, loyalty to the regime is now an act of worship. Following an order, whether it's fighting in Syria or hacking a server, is like obeying God.
That's intense. It turns political directives into sacred obligations.
Exactly. Which means hostility toward the great Satan, the U.S., becomes a religious duty. If God's representative on earth says that entity is evil, then fighting it isn't just foreign policy, it's a path to salvation.
And you can't really negotiate that away. You can compromise on a tariff. You can agree to scrap half your centrifuges. You can't really split the difference on a divine command.
You can't say, okay, we'll only fight the great Satan on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Right.
That's the core of it.
Yeah.
And the analysis uses signaling theory to explain why this is so important for the diplomats to understand.
Signaling theory, I've heard that in economics. How does it work here?
Like a tell in poker,
Yeah.
but a deliberate one. When adversarial language like Great Satan is used at the highest possible level by the supreme leader, it sends a signal to everyone inside Iran and to the world. And that signal is that the hostility is structural, not temporary.
So if I'm getting this, when Khamenei calls the U.S. the Great Satan, at the same time, his diplomats are in Geneva having coffee with their counterparts.
He's signaling to his base.
He's telling them the core mission hasn't changed.
Exactly. It's a dual-track strategy. The diplomats signal pragmatism to the West to get sanctions relief. But the supreme leader signals revolutionary purity to the hardliners, to the IRGC, to keep the regime stable.
He's basically saying, don't worry, guys, we're just cutting a deal to get paid. We still hate them.
It's a crude way to put it, but according to this analysis, it's accurate. If the supreme leader were to suddenly drop the Great Satan label, if he said the U.S. is now a partner, it would actually undermine the entire legitimacy of his revolution. It would violate Article 154.
Because the whole system is built on that opposition. If you take away the enemy, what is the revolution for?
That's the argument. The Great Satan label creates a ceiling. It caps how much relations can ever really improve. As long as that label is in place, and as long as it has that theological weight, any deal is just a transaction. It's not a transformation.
It really makes you rethink what success even looks like in these talks. We tend to think of a peace agreement as the end of the story. The credits roll.
But this analysis suggests a nuclear deal might just be a pause button on one very specific issue, while the broader ideological war just continues on other fronts.
Because the machinery we talked about, the IRGC, the Quds Force, the proxy networks, they all still have their marching orders.
And they see those orders as sacred.
So let's bring this all together. We started by asking if we're negotiating the wrong problem.
And based on these sources, especially Hadi's work, the answer seems to be that we're negotiating a problem, the nuclear one, but maybe not the problem.
The problem being the fundamental nature of the regime. We're applying these technical mathematical solutions, arm control, inspections, to a problem that's really rooted in ideology and sacred obligation.
We're trying to solve a spiritual conflict with a measuring tape. And look, no one in these sources is saying don't do a deal. Preventing a nuclear-armed Iran is obviously critical. But they're saying understand the limits of that deal. Don't expect the leopard to change its spots just because you put a collar on it. The crisis doesn't go away. It just changes shape.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a question that's been nagging at me through this whole discussion. We've talked about the Great Satan label and the supreme leader's authority.
Right.
So here's the thought. For any peace agreement to be truly legitimate, to be a real lasting peace and not just a truce, would the supreme leader have to publicly revoke the Great Satan designation?
That is the billion-dollar question, isn't it?
And if he doesn't, if that title stays in place while the ink is drying on the treaty, does the religious duty for his followers to commit acts of hostility, does that just remain active?
If the theological command is still fight, does a political signature that says peace even matter to the foot soldiers? It's a chilling thought.
Something to think about the next time you see that Progress in Geneva headline.
Indeed. And for anyone who wants to get into the weeds on how this all works on the ground, the covert ops, the militias, the machinery, I really do recommend Albert Hadi's book, Shadow Soldiers, Iran's Global Proxy Strategy. We barely scratched the surface.
It's a fascinating read if you want to understand the mechanics behind the ideology. Well, that is all the time we have. Hopefully, we've given you a new lens to look at this issue through. It's not just about the uranium, it's about the soul of a state.
Always look beneath the surface.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.